your listeners, your audience that doesn't know the story, Masih Alinejad is just an incredibly outspoken activist. I actually had the good pleasure of just seeing her over the weekend at a conference. She is a force of nature, and she has been organizing women to come out and just speak about their experience of life in the apartheid regime they live under. And they send her videos of just everyday interactions with government officials, and how misogyny seems to be sort of embedded in every part of life in Iran. And for this so-called crime, the story broke that the FBI had been monitoring this, that there was a plot to actually kidnap her, along with a number of others. Some other names were not released, including Canadians. I don't actually know who those Canadians were, but those names, there were 3 Canadians that were also.
I wasn't aware of 3 Canadians. I wasn't aware of that.
It did not get the coverage that it needed, but there were 3 Canadians, unidentified, who were part of this plot. And the idea was to kidnap these people and take them back to Iran. Now, the Iranian regime has been doing this increasingly in the past few years, where it has been luring people through deception to countries in and around Iran, like Dubai or Turkey or places like that, and kidnapping them there and taking them back to Iran and hanging them, like giving them so-called trials. They're not really trials, and killing them. And it was going to do this. It's gotten so brazen that it's now beginning to think about doing this, on Canadian soil and on U.S. soil.
Yeah.
And so unless, we take this threat very seriously, and I don't think we're taking it seriously enough, they're going to keep doing this.
Yeah. I can't do anything but agree with you on that. And we do. We embed these weird dilemmas for ourselves, as if somehow it's a cultural, religious, historical. We embed these things in which it's not that complex. Separate the individuals, the people, the everyday Iranians from the gangster regime, from the theocratic gangster regime. And Mas is a personal hero of mine. I think what she's doing is incredible. And I happily say that every Wednesday I wear something white, whether it be a puff, a shirt, something in support of what she's doing. It's amazing. It's amazing to see that in such a short period of time, the outcry, the videos that are being sent, the voices that are being heard, and the pushback. Among the pushback, they still do it, and it's of various ages. It's incredible to see it. Yeah. That kind of leads me into a thought I'd love to talk about more with you. What do you think? There's always talks on both sides of the political aisle, within Canada but abroad, of regime change. Who do you support? How do you support? Do you put in just barricades for trade and goods? Do you think we should place more emphasis on supporting direct support to and alliances with the Iranian diaspora, but also Iranians in Iran saying, yes, we're hearing you. We're not coming to for intervention to invade and to a new regime, because essentially that would just be somebody else doing it for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the worst things that the Bush administration did was obviously, the Iraq debacle, but what it did was it just made the concept of regime change, just that phrase itself, and made it such a dirty phrase that we can't even talk about that anymore. I absolutely think that we have to get over that, and regime change, people-led regime change, not through boots on the ground, not through military intervention, but people-led regime change should be the cornerstone of Western policy with respect to Iran. Yeah. This regime cannot be reformed. It cannot be rehabilitated. It cannot be welcomed into the international community. This is, as you say, it's a gangster regime. They are kleptocrats. They are terrorists. It's just in their DNA. You cannot bargain these things away, because without these elements, this regime just has no identity anymore. Those are core to its identity. Regime change has to be, people-led regime change has to be central to our policy. And what that means is, yes, we have to, first of all, differentiate very clearly between government and people. We have to identify the people inside the country, first and foremost inside the country. This cannot happen by diaspora alone, right? Diaspora shouldn't be in the business of leading movements. Like, this is really a fight for Iranian people themselves inside the country. But they have important links. And, there are a lot of people that were in Iran that were fighting, but just the situation was unsafe for them, so they had to escape. So they become important links to the people inside the country. So we have to talk to them, figure out, what steps can we take, what measures can we put in place that actually helps destabilize the regime, but gives people the tools to overthrow them. We have some this is again one of my frustrations with the Trudeau government. Trudeau and his government and the whole House voted to list Iran's Revolutionary Guards, for example, as a terrorist entity, not allow them to, they adopted a motion that they were going to do this. And this was 2 years ago. This was before the Revolutionary Guards shot down a plane that we just spoke about, killing a number of Canadians. And yet, to this day, the government of Justin Trudeau has taken no action on this. Right? This is an easy step that we can take to help, again, destabilize Iran's regime. So, if we're serious about that, and I think we ought to be, there's lots of things that we can do, again, in coordination with people inside the country and some of the leaders that are outside.
No, exactly, and it would be a very easy move on our part, and a very significant one to showcase on the global stage of where we stand, but also I think would also perhaps get other G6 nations, G7 nations in line too, and say, hey, this is the stance. If this is where Canada is going as a middle power, then this is where we should be going as other dominant global powers with how we treat Iran and how we look at what they're doing. I mean, you're right. The veil. I mean, I like to ironically say the veil of theocracy. They like to wear it, but in fundamentally, it's a gangster regime with chaotic rule base. Whatever the moment, whatever the feel of the moment seems to be the rule of the moment.
Yeah.
And if we value, the individual rights, women's rights, human rights, as Canadians specifically, then how can we not stand up for these values? How do we have how can we permit the idea of gender segregation to be a norm and accepted? It mind boggles me that we allow this. And you're right. It's not just, it's perhaps more pervasive in the Trudeau government, but it's not new to Trudeau government at all.
Yeah. Let me give you another example. Just over the weekend, I was in Washington, D.C. for a conference, as I just mentioned, and I had dinner with friends of mine, husband and wife, both adherents of the Baha'i faith. Baha'is, again, for your audience that may not know, they are a small religious group founded in Iran, now sort of all over the place, but incredibly persecuted in Iran. And so the story of this couple was unbelievable, where the husband's father at the beginning of the revolution, I mean, he had been trained in the United States as a physician. He'd come back to serve the country. But by virtue of the fact that he was Baha'i, he was disappeared in 1980. To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened to him. I mean, the assumption is that he was executed, but nobody knows for sure. The family couldn't get jobs, couldn't do anything really. And the wife of the family, the wife of this couple that I'm just speaking about, she had suffered all sorts of discrimination. And she was telling me about the sort of the underground Baha'i university that operates in Iran.
Oh,
right?
Wow.
Because universities will not, for the most part, accept Baha'is as students. And even if they do, they the Iranian foreign minister was always out there saying, no, this is not true. But this actually very much is true. Baha'is are prevented from seeking education, so they have to set up an underground university that the authorities don't know about. And once they get their degrees, they simply can't enter the workforce. So many doors are closed to them. This is apartheid. There is no other way there's no other word to use to explain how you treat an entire population like non-people, preventing them from getting education, preventing them from getting jobs, preventing them from buying houses. When we had the apartheid regime in South Africa, it took us a long time, but we eventually figured out how we ought to deal with them, which is to, completely delegitimize it in every way,
right,
and support the people that are fighting against it and celebrate its downfall. I don't know why we're not doing that with an apartheid regime that's operating under our nose.
I completely agree with you on this. I completely agree with you, Kaveh, on this one. And, you make a really good point there. I'm thinking of a comparison which I often like to pose to friends and colleagues is, we always listen to the dissenters throughout history, during the communist years, during the Cold War. We didn't listen to any official reports. We listened to the dissenters. Why are we not doing that now?
Good question. I think partly our expert class, our key institutions have a certain ideological bent that I think is a problem. Their ideological position is always to see Iran and its regime as the victim of Western imperialism, rather than to kind of, judge the government on its own merits and see how horrendous it is. The other is, I think the Iranian regime has probably learned from the mistakes of the Soviet Union and others, and it's learned to sort of bifurcate its message, right? There's
Yeah.
what it does at home, which is horrendous, and then there's the messaging that it has abroad. Up until very recently, Iran's foreign minister was a rather suave, well-spoken man named Javad Zarif, who would travel around the world, smiling and meeting with government officials and meeting with civil society and talking about how Iran is grossly misunderstood. And this is the language that was actually very appealing. And what that that wing of the Iranian government, what it has also done, and this is something that I spend a fair bit of time on, is it has established or helped establish a network of apologists in the West. It's a group that I call the Iran Lobby. They operate in think tanks, they operate in academia and media, and what they do is they sell this message of Iran being a misunderstood country where there are sort of reformists that are kind of working within the government and they're trying to fix things. And only if we normalize relations with Iran, the reformists would win and everything would be good, right? That is a false story, but it's a story that sounds very appealing. And I think it works well with the ideological assumptions that I mentioned that a lot of people.
You're right. You're right. And I've been, I myself experienced it. I've been exposed to it where I've encountered individuals who I otherwise thought I agreed with on many topics, and this topic came up, and they reframed all the women, all the men, all the youth, for that matter, who stand up to the mullahs all the time, and the gangster regime and the pleas and the positions taken by Iranians in Iran as propaganda.
Yeah.
And I remember, I intellectually stepped back from this position, from this person who I otherwise respect in many ways. I still do, but I thought, wow, what am I hearing here? I mean, it made me reassess: am I inaccurate on this? Am I getting something wrong? And then I thought to myself, no, this person has an intention of their own right now in this. So it is, and I think it's so subtle that if you're not really in tune to it for yourself, you can get duped into this lobby. I think you're accurate in calling it that. It is a very powerful lobby that where some of us are just so duped into following, and the arguments they pose. I think what's to me, what I find very skillful about it, you gotta acknowledge the skills of this, is similar to China, is they use these, they weaponize our own at fault issues against us. In a very, very, very skillful way. I mean, it has to be acknowledged when they do it. They will turn our own shortcomings against us and use them in certain ways. And it's very sad, like, using pleas of, say, human rights abuses against us in reference to something, or using, for example, one I remember I often used to like this one was, how did they phrase it? It was, that Western powers or Western governments discussing or criticizing Iran was a form of racial superiority or white supremacy. I thought that's a good way to use a dilemma we're dealing with. And it's very skillful.
True. Yeah. Now, what's interesting, I mean, this strategy is not new, right? Like, if you look at the Soviet Union, they would always go on and on about how the United States was awful and the treatment of African Americans was awful. The treatment of African Americans was awful, but I don't think the human rights situation in the United States at all resembled kind of the horrors of the Soviet Union. They would make these criticisms, but by and large, except with some communist sympathizers in the United States, people didn't buy into it, right? People dismissed it. They could see that this was morally noxious, what the Soviets were saying. The difference now, I think, is that lots more people are actually listening to and believing this nonsense, right? So you have the Iranian regime, anytime you point out to them, like, these are the horrors of your country, they turn around and they talk about, the treatment of how the police here behaves. They talk about the, First Nations people in Canada, and all these things are legitimate problems, but we have a vibrant democratic system that tries to deal with these problems through a democratic framework. Iran doesn't have that. There is no moral equivalence between these two things. Unfortunately, and this is, again, I think the role that the Iran lobby plays, is they tend to kind of validate these arguments from Iran. So if you observe some of these folks from the Iran lobby, as I do a lot, maybe 5% of the time they will talk about problems in in Iran, and the rest of the time is devoted to talking about all the horrors of living in the United States. And a lot of them live in the United States. Like they they have all the benefits of living in the West, but they spend all their time criticizing life in the United States, and that's a way of just kind of creating this moral equivalence between these societies where there is no equivalence in reality.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think for my listeners who are just unaware of what we're referring to when we talk about these individuals, these groups made up of many groups and many individuals, in very much areas of within Canada and otherwise, of the Iran lobby, is they're men, women, and they're very influential. They're very influential in their connections they have, who they know, and you can be very duped into thinking that what they're saying is coming from the heart, and they're very honest about this. I mean, it comes across very easy, and in many ways, the arguments that are put forth, and it's scary too, because you would think that especially the 21st century, that it would be a lot of, say, Western youth that would be, this would be a cause they would be for, especially the former, as I like to call it, the new left. I don't even know what the heck's going on now. These would be causes, freedom, justice, inequality. These would be causes that rightfully, historically, should be of the left. And as Masha also points out too, even too many, as Yasmin Mohammed points out too, it's too often it's those on the left who are disavowing. You might say as I like to refer to them as the illiberals, the illiberality, are disavowing. As I like to say accurately, our brothers and sisters in Iran. They're disavowing them and their legitimacy of their plea.
Yeah. So remove the name Iran, and remove the concept of the fact that the regime in Iran is a theocratic one, an Islamic theocracy. And just if you speak in the abstract, there's a government out there that treats women as second-class citizens, that has a religious minority that it denies all rights to, that crushes any sort of labor protest, that disappears its opponents, engages in torture, engages in crimes against humanity, all these things, right? If you were to explain this, like everything the left says, this hypothetical regime violates. Everything the left stands for, this hypothetical regime violates. So the left should be really committed to the overthrow of this regime and giving people back their rights. And yet when you call it Iran, and when you say this is an Islamic government, suddenly somehow the discourse changes and the moral calculation changes for the liberal left. And identity politics kicks in, and it just becomes this really weird situation where somehow speaking about this becomes verboten, it becomes this right-wing cause. And I think you're exactly right. So again, your listeners may not know this. One of the things that Masih Alinejad has launched, I think in coordination with some other people, is a campaign called Let Us Talk.
Yes.
Right?
Beautiful campaign, yes.
Beautiful campaign. It's these Iranian women coming out, especially women, but also some men, coming out and saying, like, this is what happened to me. My pointing out that I am oppressed, that I am, that my life has been taken from me in a lot of ways, that I'm suffocating. This is not Islamophobic. This is just me. Just let me talk. Let me tell my story.
Right.
Storytelling seems to be very central to identity politics. Yet when it comes to this, anytime somebody tries to talk, they're just dismissed as Islamophobic. Right.
And you've unbundled a lot of things there, a lot of really, really good points that I think we should talk about. And I don't mean just us, but we as a society talk about the fact that the criticization of the regime of Iran has nothing, just because they happen to be a theocratic regime, has nothing to do with Islamophobia. It has to do with criticizing the negation of the rights of the citizens and treating them as, subjects still in every sense, theocratic subjects.
And it's not just Iran. You will have noticed in recent months that criticisms of China's government are now being lumped in with sort of anti-Asian hate. Because dictators are recognizing the cleavages that exist in our society, these debates that are polarizing us, and they're taking advantage of it, and they're sort of using our own rhetoric against us.